had no authority. None. Mexico City. What were you doing there?
I was taking some overdue holiday.
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. This week we review the latest Bond adventure, Spectre, directed by Sam Mendes, who also directed the critically acclaimed and a personal favourite of mine, Skyfall. Ever since I saw what Mendes did with Bond in Skyfall, I've looked forward to his second Bond film. I actually got giddy to see a Daniel Craig Bond film, which has never happened before. It's been such a rollercoaster with Daniel Craig. Casino Royale was bang average, Quantum of Solace was flat out awful, and Skyfall was one of the best Bond movies ever made. So is Spectre a decent successor? Well, this video will get right into that. As usual, this will contain spoilers, but also a spoiler for the end of Arrow Season 3. I know you can't possibly imagine a link there, but there is one. Usually I start with the main character, but this is Daniel Craig's Bond. He's not really any different in this movie than he was in the previous three, so I'm going to jump straight into the villain. Franz Oberhauser, aka Blofeld, played by Christoph Waltz, is the movie's antagonist, as well as the mastermind behind Spectre. Not only that, but he is also the mastermind behind the previous three Bond films. It's not very often you find a Bond film that acts as a direct sequel, but there'll be more on that later. Oberhauser isn't in the movie much at all, especially for the first hour or so. He has that one scene from the trailer and that's it. He then doesn't reappear until just before the climax of the second act. This worked for me as it kept the mystery about him, and it sort of made him very threatening, especially that table scene. It's just a shame that the mystery itself was such fucking bullshit. So this guy's whole reason for terrorising Bond for however many years and setting up Spectre, a rogue nation, deliberate link there, who aim to control all information and surveillance in the world by uniting the governments of 9 major countries together, is because James Bond became his stepbrother when he was orphaned. That is literally it. This guy becomes an international terrorist because James Bond got quite close with his dad. The reason behind James Bond's most powerful enemy is, I didn't like you, Bond, cause you stole me da from us, so I'm gonna kill me own da and become a powerful terrorist just to fuck with you before I eventually kill you. What? Who the fuck thought that would be a good backstory or motivation? Jesus Christ. After the fantastic plot of Skyfall, I was hoping for something with thought and depth, but making the villain have a really childish sibling rivalry charge his ascent into global destruction is just beyond fucking words. I could flick on Cartoon Network and find a villain with a better cause, for God's sake. Look at Blofeld's previous motivations in Bond movies. Now look at the one in Spectre. I don't really have to say any more. Okay, so I've said my piece on one of the worst action villains ever concocted, so now I'll get on to the main Bond girl. This is Dr. Madeleine Swann, played by Léa Seydoux. It's sort of hard to know what to make of her. She's the daughter of the Pale King, who is Mr. White from Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, because you remember that guy from 10 fucking years ago, right? Anyway, she comes into the story with about an hour and a half left. She's actually a very good supporting character. She's quite funny with her banter with Bond, and she's actually an essential part of the plot. She shows she can handle herself well in action scenes and isn't a hopeless damsel in distress. I actually enjoyed her in the movie. The fault comes with what they try to use her for, and here's where the Arrow spoiler comes in, so skip to here if you want to miss it. So they use this woman, who we've seen for a grand total of about 90 minutes, as the catalyst to make James Bond quit being a spy and live a normal life. Arrow did exactly the same thing at the end of Season 3 with Felicity and Oliver, but in Arrow it actually worked because Felicity had been in the show for pretty much the entirety of the 3 seasons, and she was very well known to the audience. You can't expect to introduce a female character, no matter how great a character she is, and expect the audience to accept that she is able to domesticate James fucking Bond in an hour and a half. It's absolutely ludicrous. So when the ending came and Bond had Blofeld on the ground and Blofeld says, "Do it, finish it," I was shocked to find out that Bond didn't do it because he had something better to do, or something along those lines, and waltzed off into the fire hand in hand with his very new girlfriend. Let us not forget, Bond is a notorious womanizer. In fact, it's a trope of Bond movies that he pretty much sleeps with every woman he meets. Nothing really makes Dr. Swann stand out from the others enough that we believe she should be able to make Bond quit being a spy for her. The chemistry is alright, but we just haven't seen her for nowhere near enough time to accept that Bond would stop his entire career to be with her. There's probably more to it than that, like he's too old for this shit or something, but it's played as if she's meant to be the main catalyst for Bond's retirement. She advises Bond earlier in the film to give it all up, and when he reiterates that to Blofeld at the end, I honestly wanted to scream. The only way this would have worked for me is if she was a love interest from Casino Royale and was a persistent character in all 4 movies. There are some positives for this movie though. Its overall subplot makes a lot of sense. MI6 is merging with MI5 and they plan to solve the 00 program as it's obsolete. As C explains, 00 agents aren't needed anymore. We have drones to spy now. It turns out C is working for Spectre and Blofeld and they aim to control the global surveillance and intelligence. C thinks it's a cracking idea, whereas M explains how it isn't really a great idea to spy on everyone. With the ever-increasing use of social media and CCTV all over the place, spying in violation of privacy is at an all-time high. Many action films have tackled this idea, but Spectre actually did it quite well. I just wish that they scrapped the idea that Blofeld was behind everything in the previous 3 films and instead have him want to control information on everybody for some villainous reason. Really Rupert Murdoch the guy. Make him control the news or have him misuse the information he sourced. Skyfall tackled it a little by having Raul Silva release images of the 00 agents on YouTube. Spectre should have expanded on that to the global populace, but unfortunately it was left as a subplot. What Spectre does with the idea is good, but it could have been so much better. Where Spectre doesn't fail is the comedy. At times it knows how utterly ridiculous it is and it plays some of it for laughs, such as how Bond falls through a roof in Mexico and happens to land on a conveniently placed sofa. My favourite comedic part was in the clinic where Bond attacks 2 security guards. One gets back up and goes to attack Bond, but instead of knocking him out, Bond just sticks his hand out and goes, "Whoop whoop, no, stay," as if the guy's a dog. It works. Clearly this guy knows he'll never beat Bond in a fight, so he stands down. It was unexpected, and it worked brilliantly. In typical Bond style, he also has a vast array of one-liners, and all of them work well. The comedy is probably the best aspect of Spectre, actually. Now, Mendes created the most un-Bond Bond film in Skyfall with regards to the typical tropes. The story was delightfully simple, it delved into Bond's character a lot more than a Bond film has any right to do, it brought back an old Aston for no real reason, but it worked somehow. There wasn't an outright Bond girl, there were a couple of romantic conquests but none were focused on. It reinvented Bond in a lot of ways, bringing in a new M by killing off Judi Dench, introducing a new Q and a new Moneypenny. Mendes tries to play with a lot of the typical Bond tropes in Spectre, and mostly does a good job. When Bond orders his famous martini, shaken not stirred, the barman replies with, "I'm sorry sir, this is a non-alcoholic establishment." And when Q shows Bond the new kick-ass Aston Martin they've been working on, Q reveals that it's actually for 009, and gives Bond a pretty ordinary looking watch that turns out to be a bomb. Mendes also has Dr. Swan refuse Bond's love-making skills after she meets him. I quite like that. We'd already seen Bond shag some other bird earlier in the film, who absolutely did not need to be there by the way. They could have easily given her dialogue to somebody else. But yeah, I like that because we'd already seen Bond get down and dirty, that we didn't have to see him hook up with the main chick. All was going well until the fight on the train with Dave Bautista. After the fight, Dr. Swan says, "What do we do now?" Bond looks at her and then it cuts to him ravishing her in their cabin. It was sort of funny, but ultimately it ruined the earlier tropes version of Bond not getting the lady for me. The tropes Mendes sticks to are mostly done properly too, such as the car chase, the one-liners, and the banter between Bond and the villain. Credit to Mendes for playing with the tropes a bit though, and I think it worked well for the most part. Speaking of Dave Bautista though, I want to say that I thought he was a great support villain. He was in the movie for what felt like a little more than Blofeld was, and his battles with Bond were some of the highlights. The car chase was quite good, nothing spectacular but entertaining, and the fight on the train was great. It was utterly ridiculous, but very fun to watch. Bautista was just smashing Bond through wooden walls like they were made of paper. The fight very much emphasised the difference in size, as Bautista is an absolute Goliath compared to Daniel Craig. It was very reminiscent of the old Jaws and Bond feud. Mendes did a cracking job with this villain. I just wish he was in it a bit more and we saw more certain death than him just falling off a train. I've already mentioned Rogue Nation earlier, but I noticed that Spectre is in many aspects a very similar movie. Now I'm not saying it ripped off Mission Impossible, far from it. Spectre precedes Mission Impossible by about 5 years, but having both movies come out in the same year makes it very easy to draw comparisons. Both movies feature a villainous organisation who seek to wage war on terrorism while remaining apolitical. Both the Syndicate and Spectre are rogue nations, attempting to wreak havoc on the world. Both films also feature an entity trying to take down the organisation the hero works for. In Rogue Nation it's Alec Baldwin, and in Spectre it's C. As a result of this, the hero has to work with a team of his close colleagues with pretty much no official backup from HQ. In Syndicate, we see the scene where Tom Cruise gets Simon Pegg to come to an opera with him in order to do some techie wizard shit. In Spectre, we see Q fly out to meet Bond in a remote clinic in order to do some techie wizard shit. In no way, shape or form did Spectre copy Mission Impossible, as the film productions just overlap too much, but I feel it's worth mentioning the similarities. It's also worth mentioning a little plot point of Spectre that grabbed my interest as a massive Metal Gear Solid fan, and that was the introduction of nanomachines.
Nanomachines, 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 nanomachines.
Nanomachines, nanomachines,
Nanomachines,
nanomachines, nanomachines, nanomachines, nanomachines.
nanomachines.
That really took me by surprise. It's been around in Metal Gear for years, and I thought if Bond was ever going to use it, it would have been done a really long time ago. What's more surprising is I'm not really sure why they're there. Q injects them into Bond as it lets HQ know where he is at all times, but Bond asks Q to lie and help him do what he needs to do. Q agrees to this, and by the time anybody gives a shit that Q was lying, M tells him to wipe the whole project and pretend it never existed. I can only suspect that this feature will be used in future Bond movies. I hope so, as I want to see what they do with the idea. Most Bond films open spectacularly well. We see the gun barrel shot with Bond walking along and shooting the camera with this sweeping Bond melody in the background, and we dive straight into an action sequence which is typically the last few minutes of a mission. Spectre's takes place on the Day of the Dead in Mexico. The camera follows Bond and a woman as they go up to her room. He leaves her just as you think they're going to get it on and walks along the rooftop to his sniping spot. He snipes some guys who are planning to blow up a stadium, and in the process accidentally shoots the bomb and blows up the whole building, which absolutely nobody in the immediate area reacts to. There's crowds of thousands of people at this festival and nobody seems to bat an eyelid that Bond has just blown up a large building. Bond then finds the man he's after and chases him into a helicopter. The chopper takes off and flies above the mass crowds of people just as Bond gets aboard. Bond begins attacking not only his target, but the pilot, while hovering above thousands of innocent people. Bit risky, don't you think? The action in the opening scene is decent enough, it just has some parts of it which could have had a little more thought put into it. There's also a little question I thought of near to the final act of the film. Bond is on a train with Dr. Swan bound for Blofeld's secret hideout, which apparently is also a hotel somewhat. Anyway, Bond is heading straight for Blofeld, and Blofeld knows this, yet he still sends Dave Bautista to kill him on the train. Why? Blofeld clearly wanted Bond to arrive, judging by how he set up their rooms and had a whole exposition-fueled torture planned. Maybe I'm missing something here, but it just stood out to me a little. I mentioned earlier that Spectre throws in Mr. White from Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace. Okay, that's forcing me to remember up to 10 years ago, and since I've not watched either film since because they're fucking shite, I had a hard time deciphering who was who in the opening stages of Spectre. The details they include from Skyfall I could just about remember, as that was only 3 years ago, back in 2012, but even still, I've watched that film a few times and still had to try hard to remember certain points. You can tell Spectre is the finale to the planned Daniel Craig section of movies, but because it works as a somewhat direct sequel to not just Skyfall but Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace as well, I didn't really enjoy the fact that you needed to have prior knowledge to understand this movie. Some of you may be saying this without seeing the previous three. If so, I think you might have a hard time getting to grips with who's who and what's what. I think Mendes needed to make the film so that it worked well as a standalone, much like Skyfall and most other Bond movies do. From a technical standpoint, I think the writers in Mendes had a license to fill, as it's just so very slow and overly long. It tries its very best to angle suspense and mystery, and it does so fairly well for the most part, but there comes a point where you just get sick of it and you want the film to get to the point. I feel like the secret base scene with Blofeld could have been eradicated entirely, and instead had the plot points that occur in that scene take place in the final MI6 encounter. Instead of merely telling Bond he has the lady and that the building is about to explode, that would have been a good time to give us his motivations and what Spectre are up to. Follow up with Blofeld attempting to escape while Bond saves the girl, Bond shoots down the chopper, and the pair have a standoff or fight somewhere. Bond never lays a finger on Blofeld throughout the movie. He causes a bit of damage via the watch grenade and shooting the chopper down, but the two never come to blows or even shoot at each other. I just feel like Spectre needed to be condensed a little and needed a bigger climax. A little thing I noticed was that the famous Bond theme wasn't used that much. I think it's only used 2 or 3 times in the entire film. Okay, it's horrible when a director uses a famous musical piece too much in a movie, looking at you, Terminator Genesis, but come on Mendes, you could have added it in just a few more times. Now, you can't review a Bond movie without commenting on the song and the visuals. I'll say I'm not the biggest fan of Sam Smith, and I wasn't a huge fan of the song, but it did grow on me the more I heard it, and in the movie it didn't seem out of place at all. The visuals themselves are as good as ever. Great silhouettes and dimly lit characters being slowly molested by a giant octopus as explosions engulf the background. Okay, that sounds weird as fuck, but visually it's a joy to look at, so Spectre did a great job on that front. As with most Bond films, Spectre is shot wonderfully. Some of the lighting is absolutely beautiful to look at, and each shot tells the story in an effective way. The lighting in the table scene is especially nice as it cloaks Blofeld very nicely, and his reveal shot looks brilliant. While I said the movie is incredibly slow, it is paced well. Now, some of you seem to be confused as to what pacing is. Pacing is how well the film flows between low and slow scenes to high action scenes. Spectre builds up the action scenes well and none of it feels clunky. It just feels slow because it often takes a long time to get to one of those action scenes or for someone to actually get to the point. The CGI is also very good, as nothing seemed to particularly stand out to me as looking terrible. Everything looks solid and polished and they used it in the correct way. Spectre gets a lot of points from a technical standpoint. So to end, I'll say that for me, Spectre was a remarkable letdown following on from the massive heights achieved by Skyfall. Skyfall was gritty, different and utterly gripping. Spectre was slow, cliched at times and features an absolutely atrocious villain who can't seem to get over a little sibling rivalry. Even after I've ranted about it, I still can't get over how fucking ridiculous Blofeld's motivation is, and I can't believe that the makers of the film thought that it was a great script idea. Spectre didn't handle the female taming of Bond properly, and it just ultimately ended up serving a big plate full of half-arsed ideas. It has a good go at commenting on surveillance and the invasion of privacy, but never really runs with it. I feel like Mendes got caught in between making a proper Bond movie and another Skyfall, and the result is a Bond movie which isn't consistently ridiculous enough to be Bond, but not dark enough to be Skyfall. Sorry Mendes, but for me, you've really screwed the pooch on this one. Spectre gets a disappointing 3 frames out of 5. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Film Rant.